Hello, everyone. My name is Rashika Poranlan. I am the founder and director of Spacetime Archives, which is an educational outreach nonprofit which aims to provide unique STEM learning opportunities and resources to underserved youth, especially in our little niche of astronomy, aerospace education, and the physical sciences. Spacetime Archives runs a project called And Then There Were 10, the testimonials of 10 women fighting for educational equity, which is an interview series highlighting the journeys of 10 extraordinary women who are at the forefront of social awareness and implementation. On that note, let me introduce one of those women who we have here today, Dr. Elaine Allensworth. Dr. Allensworth is the Lewis-Sebring Director of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, where she has conducted research on educational policy and practice for the last 20 years. She is recognized as an expert in the areas of students' educational attainment, school leadership, and school improvement. I have Dr. Allensworth here with me today, and I'll let her take over and introduce herself.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, I'm Elaine Allensworth, and so I've been at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research since 1998, so a long time. And our mission is to do work that's going to inform improvement in the Chicago public schools, working to have students have better experiences, more equity in education, and we try to do work in a way where we're focused on Chicago public schools, but we're doing work that's going to be meaningful to districts across the country. So not just saying what's happening right now in Chicago in 2023 or 2024, now it's 2024, but what's going to matter, in the future too. And by doing that, we're really doing work that's of interest to districts across the country and places across the world. We're trying to get at those really deep questions, really try to understand why we get the outcomes that we get and what schools can do, what people in schools can do to really better support all students so that everyone's reaching their potential.
You are a very inspirational and accomplished individual, and I'm just so grateful to have you here with us today. And the students of Spacetime Archives were also super excited to hear that you were going to be on the interview series, and we just got so many questions flooding in. But one in particular that stuck out to me is, in what ways has your interdisciplinary academic journey from language studies to sociology contributed to your ability to address these complex issues in education, particularly in urban contexts like in Chicago?
Yeah, it's funny because when I was in a university undergraduate, I actually was one of those people who just kept changing their major because I just could not decide. I was a music major for a while. I was a chemistry major, pre-med. I thought about computer science. I ended up, in Spanish and getting a teaching degree. And then I went into sociology and urban studies. So it sounds like I was all over the place, but honestly, I feel like having that really broad perspective, that broad training was helpful in so many ways. You're constantly being told, narrow your focus, decide what you want to do. And I think a lot of times that puts people in a box and then, it doesn't allow for creative thinking. So I do think that having had, a very diverse experience in terms of my training was really helpful. And I think even today, the research that we do, if you look at educational researchers, a lot of times they focus very narrowly on a particular area in education. And, if you go into research, again, you'll be told, figure out your specialization, narrow down. But what we do at the consortium is we focus on Chicago as a district. And then we do research, and I'll do research in lots of different areas. So I'll do research on educational attainment and school leadership and curriculum and teacher professional learning. And all of those, because I'm doing research in all those areas, I can see how they all interconnect. And I think that makes the research so much more useful to people. And if you're working in a school district, if you're a family, a student, all those things are interconnected, right? And so I can speak more credibly if I understand how all of those different kind of pieces work together. And then I think the research that we put out is so much more useful. So even though we're focusing on Chicago, people all over the world use our research because it is, I think, more nuanced and and useful because we have that broad perspective.
No, definitely. The work, I was just in preliminary research for this interview. I was looking into the consortium and I was looking through some of the papers that you guys have on your website. And it was just enlightening for me since I'm a scientific researcher. So I've never really gone on that demographic statistical route. So it was interesting seeing the different applications of the same kinds of research. Like we're both working with numbers, but just in very different ways.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I will say, I think having a background, I took a lot of chemistry and
Mhm.
science classes and computer science classes as an undergrad. But then having that background and going into social science, I think was incredibly helpful. As well as I think having the training in languages and culture and yeah, it all comes together, in different ways, surprising ways sometimes.
I actually wanted to ask a quick follow-up question about that.
Mhm.
So, you began as a Spanish teacher, and you said
Mhm.
you've done a lot of work with languages and understanding cultures. Do you find that that has helped you in your work with the consortium, with interacting with different demographics, maybe overcoming that language barrier?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I, I think obviously being able to speak Spanish is really helpful. But I think also just in general, having different cultural experiences is important, in life to just help you see the world from different perspectives and in different ways. I think it brings a flexibility, to thinking, and then does allow you to work with different groups. Like in an urban context like Chicago, we have very diverse schools, very different contexts. And so I think, you know, having, lived in different countries, having, had different kinds of experiences, living, with different families, all of that has really helped me, I think, in terms of, yeah, just seeing the world in different ways. And yeah, I think, and it's not just in my job, I think in probably any job. And I do think, being multilingual is very helpful. Not just for being able to communicate again, but for seeing the world in different ways.
No, definitely. I'm sure some of the students that you encounter and interact with are very appreciative for that understanding that you might have with them, which might be different than other educational workers that they've seen before. And so the second question that has been submitted to us is the UChicago Consortium on School Research plays a crucial role in supporting stronger and more equitable educational outcomes. How do you in particular ensure that the research conducted actually aligns with the core mission of promoting equity in schools, particularly within the Chicago public schools?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of things that you need to pay attention to, and you have to be really intentional. So first of all, number one, listening. You have to spend a lot of time listening to people and being really intentional about making sure you're listening to different groups of people who have different perspectives, especially listening to perspectives of students, of teachers, family members, really, policymakers, really understanding how different folks are seeing whatever it is that, whatever issue it is that you're studying. So listening is really important. I think questioning is really important too. So we all live in these systems of inequality that exist right now. And they're invisible to us, right? And we all see only our little sliver, right? Too. And so you have to constantly question people's assumptions, right? And so a lot of what we do is we try to hear different perspectives about what's happening and then do research, to understand what is really happening and provide data that tests those assumptions and puts it out there for people to talk about. There are a lot of researchers who will like try to come up with the answers and tell people what to do, say, hey, we figured it out, this is what you should do. We do not believe in that perspective. We believe that you should, listen to different perspectives, do research, find out what's happening. And then that data, we don't tell people what to do. We then ask other people to help us interpret that data. And we put the data out there so that people we try to get people with different political perspectives to be looking at the data and talking to each other, so that instead of making arguments based on hearsay or on like extreme cases, we're always kind of focusing on extreme cases or, just rumors, but really to be working from a common base of evidence. So people may have different perspectives about what we should do with that evidence, but at least they're not talking from, rumor and hearsay, right? But from a common base of evidence. I think it's also really critical that, as you're doing, the way you do your research is really important. So getting input into your research at all points from different stakeholders, especially the people who are going to be most impacted by the research, is really important. So when you're thinking about what are the questions that we're working on, how are we framing our research, how are we interpreting our results, and then really making sure you're talking to people as you're putting out your research, so you can see how different people are, what's important to people, what they need, what will be valuable, and you're making sure that your research is useful, to different groups, and then also that you're kind of challenging yourself too, because as researchers, we're going to have our own biased perspective. And so as researchers, we have to be really intentional about opening ourselves up for critique and, critique from different perspectives. And that can be really hard. It can be hard emotionally. It can also be hard because then you got to do something about it, right? You've got to, change the way you're doing your research, or you're talking about your research, or, figuring out ways that it can be used, by different groups that will help them. So there's just all along the way, there's just a lot you need to do. And I do think, sorry, I'm going on a long
Oh, it's
time.
okay.
I do think addressing inequities requires data. Systems, if you're going to have more equity, you have to change the system, right? It requires systems change. That means people have to change what they're doing. And you never know when you try to change something what the result is going to be, because we live in very complex social systems, and usually what will happen is people will change something, but it just kind of recreates the same old what was happening before, or sometimes people will think, oh, I have the solution, and it ends up making things worse. That actually happens a lot because it's very hard to predict everything that's going to happen. And so I think data is necessary. You have to have data so that you know that what you're focusing on actually matters for students. And then that what you're doing is actually making the difference that you want it to make.
A lot of the points that you iterated were some things that I've heard from other women like participating in these interviews. I've seen a lot of interviewees talk about data as like a vehicle for social improvement, because a lot of people, when you say that there's an issue or there's an inequity, they're sort of detached from that issue, so they can't see the true gravity of it. But when you take those societal concepts and you put them in numbers, things that people understand, and you're able to quantify and see trends, that's when it truly starts to become impactful for the general public. So I definitely see the appeal of that.
Yeah. Well, and it's also for people that are actually working to change. If you look at folks in schools, I think most teachers, most principals, they really want to make a difference. That's why they go into education. They want to, support equity. They want change, but they don't know how to get there, a lot of times. And so what can happen is they just keep replicating existing inequalities, right? But because it's just very hard when you're in a system to see what makes a difference. And so I think doing research in a way that helps people see their jobs differently, and then also so they have data, so they have the data and they can actually see if what they're doing is making a difference, is really critical if you're going to get change.
Yeah, I definitely think oh, sorry, were you about to?
Oh, I was gonna say, but then also, like, I always just going on with, maybe this is what you were kind of talking about before. I also feel like data is the starting point too, because it's not having the data that makes a difference. It's having the conversations that come after the data and the actions that come after the data that actually is then also really critical, right? So it's, you can have data, but that says, hey, this is a student you need to reach out to right away, figuring out what's going on. You have to actually start talking to that student, right? And then figuring out how to support that student, or say, this is an issue in our school. Now we've got to start talking to students, coming up with solutions, to this particular issue.
I definitely applaud you for not only your effort to create such lasting change, but also in this question, you were talking about all the not guidelines, but almost values that you have to keep in mind when you're approaching students, when you're planning projects. And I just think it's pretty commendable to keep all of that in your head and just keep like striving forward with the consortium.
Yeah, I will say it's very hard for researchers. I mean, all of us, I feel like we have to have systems in place to make sure to to really support this work. I think it's very hard for a person working on their own, an individual researcher, to be able to do work in a way that really will, I think, promote equity in all the ways that we want it to do. Because you get so, focused on just getting your work done, that you can lose sight of really the need to have all those conversations and be able to be flexible enough to respond to what you're hearing. It definitely takes, I think, systems and other people to, to keep reminding you and, give you support, and, um, you know, um, and I think you have to be very planful about it too. Yeah.
It kind of relates to something that we've touched on prior, but what are some insights or lessons that you've gained throughout your journey as an educator from your time as a high school Spanish teacher to your current role in the UChicago Consortium?
Um, I guess, I don't know, this maybe is similar, but I would say you need to listen to people. And people are always telling you, oh, pursue your passion, do what you want, but I feel like a lot of the ways I've had the most impact is when I've done something that I feel like I'm just doing it as a favor for somebody, just because someone wants this or whatever. It's like, okay, I'll do this. And then, it ends up being something that's really meaningful, right? Because I think other people will tell you what they want and what they need. And, um, a lot of times, like that's actually where you're going to find your passion, is by helping other people, helping give them what they need. And then, that can be incredibly fulfilling. And maybe that sounds kind of obvious now that I'm thinking about it, but if you think about, for researchers are always told, do work that's going to, be of interest to other people in academia, or you get excited about running fancy models, or answering the question of the day, what everyone's talking about. But I found that that stuff ends up being, I feel like the same old, right? And it's when like we're working with people, community groups, or groups that are nonprofits that are working in schools or school district, or, and they say, hey, we really need information on this, or could you do this or that? That's a lot of times will take us down paths that we wouldn't have thought of as researchers, I think, or that I wouldn't have thought of as a researcher. And I'll think, yeah, I could do that for you. And then you end up learning something, and seeing things from a different perspective. So, yeah, I think it's, listen to other people. I think that's true as an educator too, as a teacher. That's one of the things that we're really trying to support right now, is helping teachers, you get feedback from students and use that in their instruction, because we just have all this evidence that it's students' experiences in school that really matter. And as a teacher, you can't read students' minds. You don't know how they're experiencing your class. You may, have some idea, but you need to be able to to know, our students feeling challenged and supported and like they belong, all those kinds of things. And so I think, again, you need to listen to people and then use that information, to figure out your next steps so that you can better support others.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also interesting hearing your insights from a student perspective. As a student, I can often tell when one of my peers is struggling or if a lesson is taught in a way that they don't understand. But often students feel scared to communicate that to teachers, especially if there's not that sort of intimate or emotional connection already pre-existing. So the work you're doing to actually develop those connections and make students and teachers able and empowered to actually talk to each other, that's pretty great work. Another question that I was meaning to ask was, given the changing nature of education, how do you plan to, or how have you stayed informed about current trends and you've incorporated them into your research agenda?
Yeah, well, I just got feedback. Yes, we do this in kind of long-term, short-term kinds of ways. I mean, big picture, we go through a research agenda setting process every 5 years, and that process takes about a year, where we meet with different stakeholder groups. So we just have focus groups with people, who have different perspectives on education, and we just say, what are the needs? What do you want research on? What do you need to know to do your job better? We always figure, our job, like we're not in schools changing things. Our job, my job is to do research that's going to make other people's jobs easier so that they can, improve schools and support students. So we want to find out like what is it that they're struggling with. And so we do that every 5 years, and it kind of gives us a general idea of the research that we want to do. And then within that, we we also just continue to have conversations and things happen. A lot of times, again, like someone will come up, like a nonprofit that's working in schools, and say, hey, we could really use this kind of information, or we could really use some data support in this way. And so we'll, help them. Or sometimes there'll be something big that happens, a big new policy, something change. And so then, and people are talking about it and feeling like, we really need to study this. And so then we'll study that. Yeah. And then we have a steering committee that's, consists of people who have different perspectives. And so they'll help kind of guide us in terms of, our research and our research agenda and what to work on. So,
Do you find
yeah. And then of course, we read and, talk to people and things like that.
do you find that it's difficult or overwhelming to stay this responsive? Because coming out of COVID, there were a lot of new educational policies enacted, like one after the other. And being the roots, do you find it hard almost?
Yes, I feel like we can never be responsive enough, honestly. And the question I get asked the most is, why aren't you studying this? Like whatever it is, it's so important. And they're always very right. It's very important. And there's only so much we can do. Um, and I always, in the back of my mind, honestly, I'm constantly thinking, oh, it seems really important. Like we really should be putting something out on this. We really should be studying that. And I feel like we can't do research fast enough, honestly, for all. And it's not just doing the research, it's also all the engagement and, putting out, publications so that people can read about the findings and we can reach different audiences. I feel like it's unending in terms of what we could be doing. And I do feel like the demands and the requests are also, constant. So it is a lot. And I think that, my staff oftentimes feel, pressure and stress, but, try to, you can only do so much, and I do think, there are a lot of other research organizations out there. I do feel like it's so critically important to make sure you're doing, research and data to lead your improvement efforts. But yeah, there's only so much you could do. So you just keep going. You have to keep going and just be okay with that.
Well, I know that the consortium, even from an outside perspective, just looking on the website, looking at the data that you've produced, I think that you guys are doing an amazing job, and I know you're creating
Thanks.
lasting.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, drawing from your experience, I know that you mainly work with Chicago public schools, but you also produce data that is used nationwide. Do you ever find instances where international perspectives or international structures of education could be applied to the US context or vice versa?
Yeah, I don't do a whole lot of work internationally, although we have had, you know, we've done some work with other people in other countries. Um, I will say I do think there's some countries that do a much better job in terms of supporting teachers than in this country, where a lot of times it's, each teacher for themselves. And where I feel like you know, the prestige and respect of teaching is maybe not as much a lot of times here as it is in some, there are other countries where being a teacher, it's a highly valued profession, and there's a lot of professionalism, and there's a lot of professional development, a lot of support around teaching, a lot of learning, right? In our system, we almost expect each individual teacher to just be good on their own. And we can't expect that. We cannot expect all teachers to be superheroes all of the time. It's impossible. And I feel like there are a lot of times there are policies to say, oh, we'll just get in the good teachers and we'll get rid of the bad teachers. But that's just not sustainable. And actually, the best teacher can't be effective if they're in an environment that's not going to be supportive of their teaching. Um, you really need to have a strong community of teachers in a school working together, strong systems of professional learning. And there's some countries where teachers just spend a lot more time in professional learning, working together so that they're better able to serve students. And I really wish that, in this country, I think there's a lot of efforts in different places, to support professional learning, professional community, but the time that's allotted for teachers to work together and to learn how to better support students, is, I think, a lot of times, is not as much and as strong, as in other places.
In your history of collaboration with Chicago Public Schools, do you have a specific project or initiative that you can think back on that stands out to you as particularly impactful or transformative in improving educational outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of them, but certainly the freshman on track work stands out as, in the forefront, which I think it was transformative for Chicago Public Schools. Um, and, um, you know, it led to just huge improvements in educational attainment in the city. So we went from having a high school four-year graduation rate of around 53%, so only about half of students were getting a high school diploma, to close to 80% in like 10 years. So there's this 27 percentage point increase in high school graduation rates in about a decade, which, if you think about the thousands and thousands of students, who are not getting high school diplomas, now getting high school diplomas. Now I think the graduation rate is close around 84, 85%. And the students who are not graduating in 4 years are increasingly students who are still in school. While it used to be, it was, mostly students who had left school without a diploma. And then with more students graduating high school, and then also we have had another big area of work around college post-secondary outcomes, which is also, supported, improvements in, preparing students for college and enrollment in college. But with more students graduating high school, there are more students going to college and more students graduating college. So that freshman on track work, I think, was really instrumental. There are a lot of, there are different pieces with that, but the key is kind of changing how people saw that first year of high school. A lot of, if you look back then, back like in early 2000s, People, saw high school graduation as something that was very hard to change. That, whether a student graduated or not was affected by, their entire educational history before they got to high school, in, by family and peers and health and, community context, all these kinds of things. And so it seemed like an impossible thing for high schools to do anything about, is to improve students' likelihood of graduation. It also seemed like you couldn't tell who was going to graduate and who wasn't going to. It just, seemed like a really intractable problem. And so, through research, we found a number of things. I mean, first of all, we found that a lot of students were doing fine until they got to high school. Like they're, in, the elementary grades, middle grades, actually they were getting, good grades. They get to high school, all of a sudden they start failing classes, right? And so there's something about that transition year that was really critical. There's also, and so, this idea like, oh, it's this entire educational history. Well, no, actually, there are a lot of students, that's the first time then they start to struggle. A lot of people thought, oh, students fail classes in high school because it's too hard for them. And, we did research and we found that no, they fail in high school because they stop coming to class. And that, the attendance and homework effort, those kinds of things were really what was underlying course failures. Not that classes were harder. In fact, classes were almost exactly the same level of difficulty in ninth grade as in eighth grade. And then, so what was making the difference was this change in context. As students got to high school, they have a lot of times more responsibility. There's a whole new context. They get these messages, it's on you to get to class, get your work done, whatever. And students interpret that as, oh, I don't have to go to English if I don't want to. I can choose whether I do this, right? And so they're getting these mixed messages, and teachers see it as, oh, it's students' responsibility. I'm not going to do anything. Well, back in elementary school, students would be walked to class. And so it's this very different context. And so if you address that context, and then that transition year is really critical, because that's the year that students are developing their mindsets about themselves in relation to high school. So do I belong here? Can I succeed? If the answer to those questions are yes, then you encounter, any kind of difficulties, you'll say, I can do this, and you'll persist. But if you're questioning, do I really belong here? Can I do this? And then teacher looks at you sideways, or you get a bad grade on a test, then you start to have this self-doubt, like, oh, she knows I can't do this and whatever. And then, and that undermines persistence and effort. And so you want to make sure that students are successful in that ninth grade year, because that is when those mindsets about, do I belong? Can I succeed? Are really, forming about high school, and they will carry through students. And that's also when students are figuring out how to do high school. And a lot of times students have lots of challenges. And the more that students have economic resources, the easier it is to meet those challenges. And the less that they have economic resources, there's so many challenges that people do not even realize. So there's so many students that it's very hard to get to school every day for different reasons. There could be taking care of family members. A lot of people are taking care of chronically ill parents, or taking care of siblings, or other members of the family occasionally, or getting to school in terms of transportation, having reliable transportation, whether having money for bus fare, having laundry soap so you can have clean clothes to get to school. There's also conflict with peers, that can, keep students from wanting to go to school, fear of being caught up in something, there's so many things. And then if you don't have resources, there's nothing you can do, right? And then there are families that have so many resources that they can, they don't have to worry about car breaking down, or, they can afford, they have medical care, they can afford for, others to help. So there's so many challenges that students are facing. And so if no one is doing anything, and students start facing, challenges for whatever reason, maybe they don't get along with the teacher. I mean, there's just lots of different challenges, right? They will start to withdraw. Students do not reach out when they need help in general. This is the rare student that does, right? Teachers will say, come to me if you need help. But, students, if they're struggling, they're embarrassed, they don't want other people to know that they can't afford laundry soap. They don't want other people to know that, they're confused in class. And so what happens is students, for whatever reason, they start to struggle. And then if no one reaches out, they start to withdraw more and more, right? And then when teachers don't say anything or don't, help them, they see the teacher as not caring. And that also makes things worse. But if a student, starts to struggle, like they miss class for whatever reason, they could be missing class, or they're not getting their homework done, or they do poorly on a test. If a teacher reaches out and says, hey, what's going on, and gives them help, then the student sees that teacher is caring too, right? And caring about them and like coming up with a solution, right? So if the student can't get to school because they don't have transportation, like figuring out how you can make sure the student gets to school every day. Or, if the student is behind on homework, saying, hey, come in at lunch, I'm going to help you get your homework done. And so they're, but you have to do that, right? And so that's a long-winded way of saying, all of those efforts. And so like once you start paying attention to the ninth grade year, and we develop data systems with the school district, we develop data systems to make it really easy for teachers to look at how students were doing in terms of the freshman on track framework, and reach out to students before they fell behind. And that's really critical to, and so that they were successful, and then they had positive mindsets about high school, and it just made a huge difference, right? And so then we had not only students are graduating more, but they're graduating with higher achievement, higher attendance, higher test scores, more AP classes, higher AP scores. So way more students graduating, higher achievement than ever before, and then, going on to college. So that would, I would say, be like the number one example, but there are a lot of others too.
That's absolutely amazing. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the insights you gave. I was like trying to keep track, and I was like
I know.
thinking about but I remember reading about Freshmen on Track on your website, but just hearing about it from you, I recognize the passion and the involvement now that was truly required in that initiative. Since we are closing out our interview time right now, I just wanted to end off on one quick question about your key goals and aspirations for the UChicago Consortium. What do you want to see from the organization in the next few years? What do you personally want to achieve?
Yeah. Well, I did mention the supporting the use of student voice in school, and in a way so that teachers, making it easy for teachers to, get information about how students are experiencing their classes, for administrators to have information about how students are experiencing schools, and be able to act on that data in terms of providing a stronger school. I really feel like that's going to be the next wave. Uh, that's one big goal. Another big goal is to make sure people are focused on the right data that really matters for students, and not spending a lot of time doing things that I think are harmful for students, and that aren't, don't support educational equity. And that I won't go into all that. That would be a lot. I do want us also to really be, so I think we need a lot of our work, has kind of been system wide, and then we look at different subgroups. But I think if we're really going to see change in equity, we should be doing more work that's really focusing on specific groups of students, and looking at them not into the context of how are they doing relative to other groups of students, but saying what really matters. And how is this one group of students experiencing school, and how can we better support them so that we get educational equity.
Well, thank you so much for those insights, Dr. Allensworth. This was an incredible experience talking to you and just learning the almost the other side of research. I've had a little bit of experience with sociology research, social science, but never like this in depth. And it still strikes me as so interesting how the same data and numbers that I would use in like a particle collision experiment, like it's not that different from like demographic numbers that you might be using.
Yeah, it's true.
So just thank you again for joining us today.